I can't speak for anybody else in here, but I love history. I read a lot of extracurricular things that have to do with history. I'm in the final throes of a 4-book series, The Search for the Ancient Order by Dr. Earl West right now. It's a history of the Lord's Church here in America from the very beginnings of the Restoration throughout the transitions and so forth all the way into the 50s. It's a fascinating book. One of the things, though, I have learned, especially studying history, and something I studied a lot in college, a lot of history then, is that history very often, how it's depicted, how the history really came down, is depicted very often with a slant. You have to understand that history is sometimes written with a perspective in mind. And I've always thought that about what people called the Civil War. I don't think there's very much civil about war. That's just my opinion of things. But I've always called it the War of Northern Aggression. Now, when I say that, I get surprising looks from guys. When I was in the Navy, I would talk about it that way. And guys would look at me like, hey, I'm from Ohio. I said, well, there you go. But nevertheless, it's a perspective that you have. And when you start studying some of the wars that we hear about, how you read it, how you understand it, really does slant the way that the history is recorded. One of the old statements that's made very often, to the victor goes the spoils. What they don't tell you is to the victor also goes the way people read the history. So it's very difficult sometimes when we read human written history to get the real deal on it. I very highly recommend, I finished a book here 2-3 months ago about Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective. Now I'll bet you, would not be surprised that they looked at that event quite differently than what we do. And it's also interesting in many cultures where the history is just nearly abolished over certain events. When you look at Japanese history and you study World War II, there's not a lot in Japanese history about World War II. Wonder why. So, when you read history, you have to keep in mind the individual writing it. That's one of the reasons I enjoy Bible history so much. In fact, when you look at this text in 2 Chronicles 36, you're looking at history. This is a written history, which is, a lot of people think is a parallel, but it's not quite parallel to the Kings. But while things were happening, it was being recorded, and that's what we have in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a repeat, of it, but there is a lot of commentary that gets to go with it. And I like this text here because there's some explanations and things as to why it is the case that the travesty of Nebuchadnezzar, that he wreaked out on God's people, occurred, why it happened. But the reason I really like this history here is, number one, there is no perspective. God wrote it, it's right. It is recorded in such a way where there is no bias. I mean, when you look at the things in history in the Bible that God has recorded, and we hear of King David, I certainly can tell you as a fact, most people who would write some history about a man would not mention the Bathsheba incident, because that would not look very good on such a great man after God's own heart. And there's folks today, I'm looking at a commentary here just this past week, and a guy was really struggling with the notion that David was a man after God's own heart, and look at what he did with Bathsheba. There you go. There's a conundrum in human behavior, but you're looking at a history that just, it tells it like it is. What I like about this history that tells it like it is in 2 Chronicles 36 is that it's trying to convey to us even today, because this is written for our learning and admonition. So what is it telling you and me today here at Park Heights? What does it say? Well, what it's doing is it's teaching us who God is. And I want to go at this text from that perspective, because we hear a lot about who God is, and people jump quickly to 1 John that Boyce is studying for us on Sunday mornings, which is a real good class, and I'll try not to, no, I'm done. But God is love, and that is one of the most popular verses that you can find about describing God, and it's true, God is love. But let me show you who God is according to the Bible as it's stated here. Because people have this misconception about God, that God is so patient and he's so loving, surely he wouldn't send me to a devil's hell for not listening listening to him, not doing what he told me, and on it goes. But that's not the God that is revealed in Holy Writ. If you look at this text, Zedekiah takes reign in verse 11. And it says here of Zedekiah, as it does many of the kings of Judah and all of the kings of Israel, they did evil in the sight of the Lord. And this evil, at its root and its base as a problem, was not humbling himself before God's messenger. Now, I don't want anyone to misconstrue here. This was not a matter of him not doing obeisance to Jeremiah, because Jeremiah was a man like all of us are. But when Jeremiah spoke for God, he should have listened to Jeremiah, because Jeremiah was telling him what God is wanting him to know. Now, I know very often it is the case that some of our preachers in the brotherhood begin to think of themselves more highly than they ought, because when you speak for God, you're speaking authoritatively, and therefore people should be listening, but we should never lose the disconnect there between ourselves and God. I am just a speaker for God. You test me. You be sure I'm teaching the right thing, because when I don't speak what God speaks, I'm wrong. And you need to catch that. And you'll stand before judgment one day and give an account for these actions, and just saying, oh, Jeff told me, is not going to work. I'm telling you now, it's not going to work. However, when Jeff or anyone teaches what God says, you better pay attention. And Zedekiah is condemned here because he didn't listen to God. Now, I don't know what kind of relationship Zedekiah had with Jeremiah. I really don't. I just can imagine with a guy that's not doing the right thing, and he knows he's not doing the right thing, he probably didn't get along with the prophet of God. That just stands to reason. But that might be implied. But nevertheless, the whole point being, he didn't listen to God. Now, what is God going to do? Because you know God is a God of love. He is a God of patience. He is a God of mercy. We could stack text upon text that tells us those kinds of things, and they are true. He is. But does that mean, because he is so long-suffering, I mean, that's why we're still alive. 1 Peter says that. He's long-suffering, not willing that any should perish. But in the same voice, through Jesus in Matthew 7, 13, and 14, we understand that most folks are not going to heaven. Well, how is that? If God's not willing that any should perish, where's the problem in the scenario? It's the people who choose poorly. That's what you have in this text. Now, what we need to understand is God is a God of love. He is very merciful. He is incredibly patient. I think each one of us may be an illustration of that very point. He's very patient with us. We're still breathing because he has work for us yet to do, and things that we can fix in our lives to make us better as servants of his. That being said, does he ever run out of patience? You know, there comes a time, and I can remember vividly, I was going to ask for a hand raising. I don't think I'll do that, but I was going to say, most of us as we were raised, and I'm looking out in my audience here, noticing several gray hairs, except those that are colored. But anyway, there's several gray hairs out here. And I bet, I'm not bet, but I would say that going back into your history, some of you more aged and respectable membership, you had probably received a spanking at some point in your life. I know that's not in vogue these days, hence our society, but nevertheless, back in the day, it was quite popular. When a kid got out of line, you reached up, worked him by the arm, and you applied the Board of Education to seek learning, and that fixed the problem very often. Nevertheless, when it comes to God, when does he get fed up with it, tired of it, and say, okay, I'm going to spank? See, you can go back in history and how God related to humanity. And when Eve took of that fruit and gave some to Adam, and Adam blindly followed his wife instead of following God, he kicked them both out of the garden. And you and I are still dying physically to this day because of that mistake. Do you think God ever runs out of patience? Or you look just a little further down in the book of Genesis, where you get to Genesis 6 and you get to Noah. Is there any scope or magnitude in which God is just immune because there's too many of them, so God's not going to worry about it? There's enough of us that feel this way, so by numbers we're going to be okay. No, all the lemmings went off the cliff in that little account, and Noah built an ark, and 8 souls of the entire population of the planet passed away. Does God ever run out of patience? What we see here is the history of the Jewish people, this special people that God started all the way back with Abraham, saying, your seed all nations of the earth are going to be blessed, and I'm going to put you in this country, give you everything you can see. And Moses got to see it. Didn't get to go in, but he got to see it. So that was quite a vast array of property out there that was God's people. And he had a special people, and he had a special law that was for them. And he gave it through Moses. And so they were just different and unique, and they were special. So because of their specialness, are they immune to God's running out of patience? I think not. And this is a history of where God runs out of patience. Notice some of the factors that created that. The first one is the king, Zedekiah, rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar. But it's interesting here, and this is very much an embarrassment. You've heard the illustrations that people use sometimes, how embarrassing it is when people who are not Christians don't claim to be Christians, and yet their conduct is so much better than some people who claim to be Christians. Well, guess what we have here? Nebuchadnezzar makes him swear to God. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar, by the way, understood who God was, and we could go into that, chase that rabbit sometime, but Nebuchadnezzar knew who God was. He knew Zedekiah ought to know who God is, and he made him swear by God, and guess what? This fellow was an oath breaker. Zedekiah made an oath to God, but then he got stiff-necked, and he hardened his heart, and it doesn't say he turned against Nebuchadnezzar and the oath he made with Nebuchadnezzar, because that wasn't the case. He made an oath to God that he would serve Nebuchadnezzar as God told them they ought to. And so he was an oath breaker. You go further down the next one, all the leaders in the religious organizations were sorry, and they were transgressing. They had abominations of all the people of the land, and they defiled the house of the Lord and the things he had consecrated in Jerusalem. So you had religious leaders going off the deep edge. And so further on down, God's giving them warnings. All the time during the course of their demise as a people, God is giving them warnings. And here's where the Bible is so consistent in verse 15, the last phrase of that. He had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. You know, most folk don't look at warnings like they should. People, you warn somebody and they say, who are you to tell me what to do? You ain't the boss of me, or those kinds of things, you know. Instead of looking at, wow, thank you. I could have just had a tragic incident occur, and you've warned me, and so I owe you a debt of gratitude because you kept me from harm. Now, so many people who teach people the Bible would love to have that kind of response. When you tell them the truth of the Bible, normally they just take offense and get hurt feelings and get upset because you condemn them and you've judged them, and on it goes, instead of being grateful that you love them enough to warn them. And God said he warned them. Of course, their response was classic of those who rebel against God. In verse 16, they mocked and despised and scoffed. And the real kicker, and the door closed, the mic drop, all of those neat expressions we use to say, oh, it's done now. And it's that kind of emotion that I got right after Mom would say, wait till your dad gets home. My life ended at that point. I knew when Dad got home, he would never believe my story over Mom's. He was going to believe everything Mom said, and he was going to beat the tar out of me. And I had lots of tar in me, so it took a while. The point being, there was an emotional crushing at that moment, knowing I did wrong. I know I did wrong. I got caught. I'm going to have a consequence that followed that poor decision. The way it's phrased here is neat in the Hebrew, but the English does a real good job in translating it. He said, the wrath of the Lord arose against the people till there was no remedy. That's a God that people don't get today much. Because you can press God to a point where he says, I'm done. Now nobody wants to see that point. But that happens. As a matter of fact, turn over in your Bibles to Romans chapter 1, because Romans chapter 1 is kind of a New Testament example of how you can get as God's chosen people if you don't realize there's a limit to his patience. It is urgent when someone warns you kindly and lovingly, or even harshly, and it's coming across kind of mean. You need to get your life back in order. Well, you do. Because your life is like a vapor. It's here for a little while and then it vanishes. You do not know when you leave this building, if we leave this building, that you're going to continue to live. And the question would be, is your soul right with God right now? And if not, do you not see the urgency in getting it right? Because there comes a time when God said enough. That's it. In Romans chapter 1, this is such a sad statement of fact, as things are, with a God who loves you dearly and is patient with you and does everything they can. In chapter 1, verse 24. Therefore, after 18 through 23, saying how people get rebellious against God and won't listen to Him. Therefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness and the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Likewise, in verse 27, men leaving the natural use of natural use of woman, burned in their lust for one another, men committing with men what is shameful. I mean, you're looking at the results of what's going on when, in verse 28, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, He gave them up to a debased mind. Now, does God ever give up on people? Why, yes, He does. And we don't ever want to see that. We don't ever want to get close to that. As a matter of fact, we need to be diligent in searching out God to do what He wants us to do, never deciding, well, I think I've done enough, or I'm in good stead. I don't need to do any more. If you'll go on further down in the text in 2 Chronicles 36, the end came right after that statement till there was no remedy. Therefore, He brought against them the king of Chaldeans. And man, from then on, it's nothing but havoc. No compassion was had by this conquering king over the children of Israel, on their young men, virgins, their aged, their weak. He gave them all into their hand. He took everything that was the people that was special, and He destroyed them. The next verse, He took everything that was related to God, those things that they revered, and that was their kind of connection with God. He took them all these treasures and everything. Kings took off with it, burned everything. Verse 19, burned down their beautiful house of God in Jerusalem, totally devastated it. And then finally in verse 20, if you escaped the sword, He carried them away into Babylon, and they became slaves, basically. It's almost like it'd be better to die than have to go into that kind of slavery. But notice why He did this. Because He is God, and through the warnings that Jeremiah gave, He was consistent. See, that's where we lack sometimes as parents, as good friends, who are willing to warn someone we love. There is a consistency that's lacking, and we assume that God is like we are, and He's not going to be consistent. He's merciful. He's loving. He's not going to... His patience will never wear out with me. Just because of the fact that we do that kind of thing, and God's not like us, we shouldn't assume that God doesn't have a limit. And when He gets to His limit, He's going to be consistent. You know what's interesting at the conclusion of this text we just read? Is that when God did get fed up with them and He torched them, I mean totally, completely torched them, He said, and this is one of those punchlines where He just digs in and says, now, didn't I prophesy by Jeremiah that this is going to happen? I don't know how many times my mom said, did I not tell you not to do that? Yes, Mom, you did, 25 times. I just didn't listen. But I'll listen if you tell me 26. No, it's too late when Dad gets home. So God says in this final statement, as long as she lay desolate, that was Jerusalem, all the place around Canaan, everybody gone, out being slaves if you weren't dead already, nothing remaining of what was their relationship with God. As long as she remained desolate, they had a land now that kept the Sabbath. They did what God, the land's going to do what God said, because God's in charge of the land. He's in charge of the people too. You know, it's hard to look at God like this sometimes for people because they don't think of God in a balanced fashion. God loves you so dearly. God wants you to go to heaven. He's not willing that any should perish. 1 Peter 3:5, He cares, or 5:7, He cares for you. He does. But don't be fooled into thinking that there will not come a time when you continue to ignore Him that He says, enough. Think of Adam and Eve. Think of Noah. Think of 2 Chronicles 36, the children of Israel, when God said, enough. We're done. You know, when you look at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 that is predicted by Jesus in Matthew 24, it also throughout Revelation. That devastation was unlike anything that had ever been seen on the planet at the time. Historian Josephus tells of horrors that transpired during that conquest. Scared people to death, scared people that weren't even involved in it. People who were not Jewish people sat back, and even Revelation talks about people who are foreign and watching the massacre and saying, wow, that's horrible. What in the world has become of them? And what that teaches us is God does have a limit to his patience. He loves us. He wants us to be saved. But don't think because of that, we got all the time in the world. There's an urgency in getting your life right. If your life's not right, get it right now. Don't wait. Don't test God's patience. The fact that you want to be God's child is very commendable. The fact you're here listening to a sermon from God's Word is commendable. We need to keep doing that, and I would encourage you, keep on keeping on. But don't test his patience. It just won't work out well. If you're not right with God tonight, for whatever reason, if you're not right with God tonight, don't test his patience. Make yourself right with God. And we always invite with a song. Won't you stand as we sing?